both of you.
What is free software? Free software is software that respects the user's freedom and the social solidarity of the user's community. So it's a matter of freedom, not price. To understand the word free in free software, think of free speech, not free beer. We're not concerned with price at all. That's a minor practical side issue. We're concerned with something that's ethically important. We're concerned with your freedom. When software is not free, we call it proprietary software, non-free software, user subjugating software. Because non-free software keeps users divided and helpless. Divided because they're forbidden to redistribute it to others, and helpless because they don't have the source code, so they can't change it. They can't even tell what it's really doing to them. And often it does something malicious. But what I've said, let's see if I can we turn this off? One. Gee, well, how did that happen? Anyway, but what I've said is very general. It respects your freedom. What freedom is it? There are 4 essential freedoms that define free software. A program is free software if you, the user, have the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and then change it to make it do what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others, the freedom to redistribute exact copies of the program to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is a freedom to contribute to your community, to distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. If the program gives you these 4 freedoms, then it's free software because the social system in which it is distributed and used is an ethical system, respecting freedom and community. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the program is proprietary software because it imposes an unethical system on its users. Now, I'd like to emphasize that each of these freedoms literally means the freedom to do something if you wish. None of them is an obligation. You're free to use the program as you wish, but you don't have to. You can use it in ways that you hate. You're free to do that too. You're also free not to use it. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study and change the source code, but that's not an obligation. You can just get it and run it if that's what you prefer. Freedom 2 is the freedom to redistribute exact copies, which includes giving them away or selling them, but you're not required to. You're not required to make a copy every time somebody knocks on your door and says, I'd like one. Now, you might feel for other reasons that it's the right thing to do. But on the other hand, if there were a line of 1,000 people asking, you could just say, please download it from such and such a place. I'm busy today. And freedom 3, the freedom to distribute your modified versions, you're free to do that, but you're not required to. You can write a modification and just run it yourself. You don't have to ever distribute copies. Of course, if your change is generally useful, it's a good thing if you do. Now, as you can see, this distinction is not a technical distinction. It's not a matter of how the code works or what computing it does. The same code could be distributed as free software or as proprietary software, and sometimes the same code is distributed in both ways in parallel. So this is an ethical and therefore social and political distinction, not a technical one. And that's why the principle of technological neutrality, which I think is a good principle, does not apply to it, because that applies to technical decisions, not to ethical ones. Now, the use of a free program in society is good. It's a form of social development, because the free program is knowledge that the users are allowed to understand and then maintain, adapt, and extend to their own needs. But the use of a proprietary program in society is not development, it's dependence. It's a harmful practice, it's a social problem, and the goal should be to get rid of it. To develop a free program is, in general, more or less a contribution to society. I say more or less because the amount of contribution, of course, depends on details. But developing a proprietary program is not a contribution to society, it's a power grab. This proprietary program, in social terms, operates as a trap. If it has any attractive features, those are the bait for the trap. They attract people to surrender their freedom and become users of the program. And that is not good. So, if you have a choice between doing nothing at all and developing a proprietary program, it's better to do nothing. Because if you don't do anything, then you don't do any harm. So the goal of the free software movement is that all programs be free so that all their users can be free. But why are these four freedoms essential? Why define free software this way? Each freedom has a reason. Freedom 2, the freedom to help others, the freedom to redistribute exact copies when you wish, is essential on fundamental moral grounds, so you can live an upright life as a good member of your community. If you use a program that denies freedom 2, then you are in danger of falling into a moral dilemma. It could happen at any moment. Whenever your friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" In that moment, you will face a choice between two evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to refuse your friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. Now, if you're in this dilemma, you ought to choose the lesser evil, which is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. What makes this a lesser evil? Well, if you're stuck with doing wrong to somebody or other, the lesser evil is to do it to somebody who deserves it because he has done wrong. We can assume that your friend is a good friend and a good member of your community and normally deserves your cooperation. By contrast, the developer of the proprietary program has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community, and that makes him evil. So if you can't avoid doing wrong to one or the other, do it to the developer. But being the lesser evil doesn't mean it's good. It's never good to make an agreement and break it, not even when the agreement is inherently evil and keeping it is worse than breaking it, as is the case here. Still, breaking it doesn't rise to the level of good. And if you give him a copy, what will he have? He will have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program, which is something rather nasty, almost as nasty as an authorized copy. So, when you have fully understood this dilemma, what should you really do? you should make sure you are never in it. I know two ways. One is don't have any friends. That's the way implicitly suggested by the proprietary software developers. The other way, my way, is reject this software. If someone offers me a program on the condition I not share it with you, I say, my conscience does not permit me to accept that condition, so take your nasty program out of here and get out of my office. And that's what you should say too. You shouldn't even consider as a possibility using software that forbids sharing, because it will make you live an evil life, and eventually you may even get used to it to avoid cognitive dissonance, and you may start telling yourself that such evil is good. And to avoid this, we have to also reject the propaganda terms that the proprietary developers use to demonize cooperation and sharing. Terms like pirate. When they call the people who help other people pirates, what are they really trying to say? They're trying to make us assume, and they hope without questioning the assumption, that helping others is the moral equivalent of attacking ships. But ethically speaking, nothing could be more false than that, because attacking ships is very bad, but sharing is good. So we shouldn't call them both by the same name. That's propaganda. Therefore, when people ask me what I think of piracy, I respond that attacking ships is very bad. In other words, I pointedly reject their propaganda meaning for the term. I won't use their propaganda term just because they do. And when they ask me what I think of software piracy or music piracy, I say, from what I've read, pirates, when they attack, don't do it by running software or by playing instruments badly. They attack with arms. Playing instruments badly and loud might work, but on the other hand, it might start a new style. The crew of the ship being attacked might just love it. So arms are more reliable, I think those pirates have found. So their piracy is neither software piracy nor music piracy. Well, you get the point. We've got to be on the lookout for the propaganda terms that they keep trying to establish as the fashionable way to talk about things, hoping that we'll be tricked into repeating their propaganda to sound fashionable. You'll find lots of these terms if you look. Like one of them is, quote, intellectual property, unquote. Anyway, that's the reason for freedom too. The freedom to help others, the freedom to redistribute exact copies when you wish, essential on basic moral grounds. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program as you wish, is essential for a different reason, so you can control your computing. You deserve to have the control of your computing. Nobody else should. So there are proprietary programs that whose licenses restrict even the use of authorized copies. And that way you don't control your computing. One proprietary program for running websites says in its license that it's forbidden to use the program to publish anything that criticizes the developer. So in this case, proprietary software literally takes away your freedom of speech. Well, obviously, if you're not even allowed to run your copy however you wish, then you don't control your computing, and thus freedom 0 is essential. But it's not enough, because that's just the freedom to either do or not do whatever the code is already set up to let you do. which means the developer continues imposing decisions on you, not through the license, because you have freedom 0, but instead through the code itself. However, the result is the same. You don't control your computing. So in order to have control, you need freedom 1, the freedom to study the source code and then change it so that it does your computing the way you wish. This way you decide instead of letting the developer impose his decisions on you. If the program doesn't have freedom 1, you can't even tell what it's doing. And these programs often have malicious features, intentionally designed not to serve the user, but rather to spy on the user, restrict the user, even backdoors to attack the user. And this is not a rare case. It's not like the danger that you might get robbed on the street. Yes, you might, but it's very rare. You could go for years and years and years and it never happens. But being the victim of malicious features is the usual case with proprietary software. One proprietary package that you may have heard of that has all 3 of those kinds of malicious features is called Microsoft Windows. People have found spy features that send messages with information about the use of the machine. Of course, you can see that there are features for digital restrictions management, DRM, also known as digital handcuffs, that restrict what users do with the files in their own computers, effectively saying you don't really own this computer. And then it's not so not so easy to see the back doors, but people have found some. For instance, there's a backdoor that allows Microsoft to remotely impose changes in software, and to do so without asking permission of the theoretical owner of the machine. I say theoretical owner because really, once Microsoft has Windows running in the machine, Microsoft has owned that machine because it has total control. So, and that's only one of them. There's at least one more. So the result is that Windows is extremely malicious software, but it's hardly unique. Windows Media Player has a spy feature. It reports, I think, whatever the user looks at. But Real Player did the same thing, and it looks like Real Player did it first. Of course, Microsoft imitates more often than it invents. And then there's the Macintosh, which is well known to have digital handcuffs. And also, it doesn't seem to have a back door to forcibly install upgrades, but Apple has essentially bullied users into installing malicious upgrades by telling them that certain services will stop working if they don't. And then the newer Apple products, the iGrown and the iBad, they're much worse. Apple is now the pioneer in maliciousness. Apple has gone so far as to take control over the installation of applications. Users are not allowed to install whatever software they choose. They can only install what they get from Apple's store. And there's a back door that Apple can use to remotely deinstall applications. So if Apple approved an application and a user has been running it for months or years and then Apple changes its mind, Apple can order that iGrown or iBad to deinstall the application and then it's gone. So that's pretty bad. But then there's the Adobe Flash Player, which has digital handcuffs and also spyware. Specifically, the surveillance functionality. It's not exactly spyware. It enables websites to spy on the user because the Adobe Flash Player implements something like cookies in the browser. They're called super cookies because the user has no control over them. The browser lets users decide and specify what cookies to accept and allows users to get rid of them. The Flash Player doesn't let users have any control or any information about cookies. It's ideal for sites to use to cross-identify the user. So it's an extremely malicious program. If you made the mistake of installing that, you better delete it right away. Then another instance is the Amazon swindle. Oh, they call it the Kindle. This is a so-called ebook reader. What does that mean? An ebook, literally speaking, means a book in digital format. I don't see anything wrong with that, but in practice, it normally means a book in digital format with DRM, and that is something you should never accept. You should never get any product that was designed to restrict you unless you personally have the means to defeat the handcuffs, to break them. So, for instance, if you have the free software that can decrypt the video in a DVD, then it's okay to play encrypted DVDs. But otherwise, you should refuse to have anything to do with them. I don't have that program. And so I just never play encrypted DVDs, and I won't even accept one as a gift. But in any case, let's look at what the Amazon swindle does. It's designed to take away the traditional freedoms of readers. For instance, the freedom to buy a book anonymously, pay in cash, which is the only way I buy books. With the swindle, that's gone because the only place you can buy most recent books is from Amazon, and Amazon requires users to identify themselves. There goes your freedom. And this means that Amazon maintains the list of all the books that each person has bought. And that list is such a threat to human rights that its existence cannot be tolerated anywhere. We need not raise the question of whether Amazon in particular can be trusted with it, because obviously no one can be. And then to take away the freedom to give your book to someone or lend your book to someone or sell it to a used bookstore, there are digital handcuffs, DRM, which make those things impossible to do. And then there is the freedom to keep the book for as long as you like and read it as many times as you like. The swindle takes this away with a back door that allows Amazon to remotely delete books. We found out about this back door in 2009 because Amazon used it spectacularly, deleting thousands of copies that people had bought directly from Amazon. And the book with which Amazon demonstrated the Orwellian nature of its product was 1984 by George Orwell. If I were writing fiction, I wouldn't dare write this. It would be too ironic a coincidence. But this is the fact. So apparently it's called the Kindle because it's designed to burn our books. So make sure all your friends are warned. Make sure they all understand what it would mean to start using that product. It would mean ending their friendships. It would mean telling everyone they know, you're not my friend anymore because I don't lend books to you anymore. Imagine going to a friend's home and there are no books. You can't look through the friend's books. You can't browse them. And you can't ask to borrow one. And it's not because your friend doesn't read. It's because all her books are in this thing, and the only way she could lend you one is to lend you her whole library. And that's obviously too much to ask. So no more friendship among readers. Make sure your friends understand this before they consider starting to use one of these malicious products. So, malicious features in proprietary software are not rarely encountered. Most of the non-free software that people are using in the world is these things, these malicious programs. But I won't claim that every non-free program that lacks Freedom 1 has malicious features, because I don't know, and there's no way to find out, because we don't have the source code, so we can't study them. So in certain cases, we happen to know of malicious features. And then there are lots of cases where we just don't know. And I suppose some of these programs have malicious features we haven't found out about yet, and others don't. But we can't identify which do and which don't. However, without knowing anything more, I can say something about all the programs that deny you Freedom 1. Namely, their developers are human, so they make mistakes. The code of those programs has bugs. And the user of a program without Freedom 1 is just as helpless facing an accidental error as facing an intentional malicious feature. If you use a program without Freedom 1, you are a prisoner of the program. We, the developers of free software, are human too. We also make mistakes, and the code of our free programs also has bugs. But if you find a bug in our free code or anything in the code you don't like, you are free to change it because we did not make you a prisoner. We can't be perfect. We can respect your freedom. So Freedom 1 is essential. But it's not enough, because that's the freedom to personally study and change the source code of the program, or to do so within one organization. And that's not enough, because there are millions of users that don't know how to program. They are unable to exercise Freedom 1. But even for programmers like me, Freedom 1 is not enough, because we're busy doing other things. And besides, there's so much free software already in the world that no user is capable of personally studying and mastering all the code of all the software that she uses, or personally writing all the changes that she might want, because that's more work than any one human being is capable of doing. So the only way we can fully have control of our computing is to do it working together, collaborating, and for that we need Freedom 3, the freedom to contribute to your community, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. This allows us to work together, because if one person or a few people make a certain change, and then if they publish their modified version, we can all use it, and we don't have to write that change, each one of us. It's enough for it to be written once, and then made available to the community, and then we'll all use it and we'll all build on it if we think it's good. And this way, the users that don't know how to program or are too busy to get involved in working on that particular program get the benefit of the improvements made by the rest of the community. Now, all users can get the benefit of the 4 freedoms. Every user can exercise freedom 0 and freedom 2. The freedom to run the program as you wish and the freedom to redistribute exact copies, because these don't require programming. Even non-programmers can do them. Freedoms 1 and 3, the freedom to study and change the code and then the source code and then optionally distribute copies of your modified version, these entail programming. So any given user is more or less able to exercise these freedoms according to how much he knows how to program. Of course, lots of people don't know how to program and can't directly exercise these freedoms, but when others who are programmers exercise these freedoms and when they publish their modified versions, everybody can then install them or not as she wishes, so everybody gets the benefit of living in a society where we all have these freedoms. And the users that don't know how to program and can't exercise these freedoms can take advantage of them indirectly, because the support for a free program is a free market. And if you would like a change to be made and you don't know how to write it yourself, you can pay a programmer to write it for you. You can pay any programmer who wants to do the job and you're willing to pay. By contrast, the support for a proprietary program is typically a monopoly. Only the developer has the source code, so only the developer can make a change. The user that wants a change has to beg and pray, "Oh, almighty developer, please make this change for me." Some developers say, "Pay us and we'll listen to your problem." If the user pays, the developer says, "Thank you so much. In 6 months there will be an upgrade. Buy it and you'll see if we fixed your problem, and you'll see what new problems we have in store for you." But with free software, anybody with the requisite skill that can get a copy of the program can study the source code, master it, and begin offering support. So those users that really value good support and are willing to pay for it, because good support is always going to cost, at least you have to always expect it's likely to cost. You may occasionally get it gratis. They will get better support for their money through the free market of support for free software. Paradoxically, if you have a choice of proprietary programs to use, that's still monopoly. Because if you choose this proprietary program, then you fall into this monopoly for support. But if you choose this proprietary program, you fall into this monopoly for support. No matter how many proprietary choices you have, each one leads to a monopoly for support. So it's a choice between monopolies, but it's still monopoly. A choice of proprietary programs is nothing but the opportunity to choose your master. Freedom means not having a master. And what the 4 freedoms together give us is democracy. A free program developed democratically under the control of its users. Because every user can participate as much as he wishes in society's decision about the future of the program, which is simply the sum total of all the individual decisions that the users make about what to do with it. By contrast, a proprietary program develops under the dictatorship of its developer and operates as an instrument of that developer's power over the users. And with this unjust power, the developer can then command them, exploit them, and abuse them. So we have a choice between 2 ways of life. We know that computers don't have minds of their own. They do what humans tell them to do. But which humans tell your computer what to do? If you're using free software, then you tell it what to do. If you're using proprietary software, then somebody else tells it what to do and deigns to let you make certain decisions whenever he wishes. So either the users have control of the program or the program has control of the users. With free software, the users have control of the program, both individually and collectively in whatever groups they choose to assemble into. They have control of the software. With proprietary software, the program controls the users and the developer controls the program, which means the developer controls the users. So society has a choice to make. On one side, we have individual freedom, social solidarity, and democracy. On the other, we have dictatorship of the developer that can command, exploit, and abuse the users. Society must reject proprietary software and choose free software. And thus, the overall goal of the free software movement is the liberation of cyberspace and all of its inhabitants, including you. I launched the free software movement in 1983. In the 1970s, I had participated in a free software community, which originally included parts of MIT and other universities and sometimes companies as well. But it gradually got narrower till by 1980 it was only a couple of labs at MIT, and then it died. And when it died, I had already come to love freedom by experiencing it. And then I saw the prospect of a life using proprietary software, being subjugated, and even worse, probably developing proprietary software, which would mean that I would also be guilty of helping to subjugate others, which would in no way lessen the disgust of being subjugated myself. So I wanted to make it possible to use computers and have freedom. But how could I possibly do that? Not many people agreed with me. I had not much fame. I was only known among the users of Emacs. So I didn't think that it would be possible to change this sad lack of freedom through a classical political movement, protesting in the streets and sending letters to officials. And besides, I had no experience doing that kind of thing. I was not a political activist. I was an operating system developer. But I realized then the problem existed because all the operating systems for modern computers of the day were proprietary. So anytime you bought a new computer, the next thing you'd have to do would be to give up your freedom by getting and installing a non-free operating system. I could change that simply by writing another operating system. Then, being its author, I could legally make it free, and then everybody would be able to use computers in freedom with my system. In other words, I could eliminate the injustice of being obliged to use proprietary software with technical work in my own field. I was aware of an injustice that most people didn't recognize as an injustice. I had the necessary skills to try to eliminate it, and it looked like nobody else was going to try. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty. It's as if you see somebody drowning and you know how to swim and there's no one else around and it's not W. Then you have a moral duty to save that person. Well, I may have said something too strong. We might be able to identify some other people about whom I should not make the claim that you have a moral duty to save them. You know, people like Cheney and Rove and Obama, not very different from Bush after all, still practicing torture and disappearances and protecting the torturers. But fortunately, I don't need to resolve these questions because I don't know how to swim. However, in the real case that actually occurred in my life, the work to be done was not swimming, it was writing lots of software, and that I knew how to do. So I decided to develop a free software operating system, or die trying. Of old age, that is. Because at the time, the free software movement, which I was starting, had no active enemies. Now, of the people who heard of the idea, perhaps more than half were opposed, but they didn't see any reason to bother trying to oppose the movement because they were sure that the job was so big we'd never finish it anyway. I too recognized that it was a big job. I couldn't say, I'm sure it will succeed, but at the same time I realized that failure was not an option. If we didn't develop a free software operating system, then no computer user would ever have freedom. So, I decided to develop a free operating system. I decided to recruit others to help so we'd finish it sooner. I decided to follow the design of Unix because Unix, although proprietary, was a portable operating system capable of running on different models of computers from different manufacturers. And I wanted to make my system be portable too. Otherwise, it would be vulnerable to becoming useless if the model of computer it was developed for was discontinued. The only way to avoid that tremendous risk was to make a system that could be ported to various kinds of computers that could live on beyond whichever one kind of computer it was first developed for. And then I decided to implement the same commands as Unix, at least them and more, in other words, to make it upward compatible with Unix, so that the many users of Unix would find it easy to switch without having to learn everything from scratch. And then I gave the system a name which was a joke. The system is called GNU, G-N-U. And GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix, a recursive acronym. Well, of course, programmers love humor based on recursion. And sometimes people say to me, well, yeah, I know GNU's not Unix, but what does the G stand for? So I explain to them it stands for GNU. And some people just don't seem to get it. And so it's also amusing, if someone asks you, what's GNU? You can respond, GNU's not Unix. And it sounds like you are being obnoxious by telling them what it's not instead of telling them what it is. But in fact, you are telling them what it is. It only sounds like you're obnoxiously refusing. But why GNU and not FNU or SNU or UNU? Well, GNU is a word, and the others are not. In fact, GNU is the most humor-laden word in the English language, used in countless wordplays. And the reason is, according to the dictionary, the G is silent and it's pronounced new. So anytime you want to write the word new, you can spell it GNU and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. So the result is that the word it's associated more with jokes than with anything else. So as soon as you see that word, you're almost ready to laugh. However, when it's the name of our system, please do not follow the dictionary. Because if you call it the new system, you'll get people confused. You see, we've been working on it for more than 26 years, and we've been using a version of it for more than 18 years. So it's not the new system anymore. But it still is the GNU system. And that's the way you should pronounce it. One other erroneous pronunciation you should watch out for and avoid sounds like Linux. Millions of users of the GNU system believe they're using a system called Linux, which doesn't exist, never existed. How could such a bizarre error get started? It was a historical mistake, a confusion of a few people that spread faster than we can spread the correction. What happened was that during the 80s, our job was to develop somehow obtain as free software all the hundreds of components needed for a Unix-like operating system. So some of them we were lucky and we found, and others we wrote. By 1992, we had almost all of the system, but one major essential component was missing. That was the kernel, the program that allocates the machine's resources to all the other programs that you run. Now, we were working on a kernel. As it happens, that project hasn't been much of a success. It sort of runs, but it runs, but not very well. And so we don't recommend that people use it unless they want to work on it. But in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had a non-free kernel called Linux, released it as free software by releasing it under the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL. Now, the GNU GPL was one of the various free software licenses that existed. Some people mistakenly think that to be free software is to be under the GNU GPL, but that was never true. I mean, Tech was free software just barely before I even started the GNU project, and it has a different license. There are various free software licenses. Well, why does a free program need to have a license? Well, the reason is that under today's copyright law, any program automatically is copyrighted by virtue of being written down. It's a written work. It's considered a literary work, and they're automatically copyrighted. And copyright law, by default, forbids people to copy the program, modify it, distribute copies, and in some countries even forbids running the program. So how can a program possibly be free? Only through, what company is that? I see. Yeah, do you know that they deliver this on pogo sticks? That's why they call it Poland spring water. But the thing I wanted to make sure it was not Coca-Cola company water. Now, I don't know if it tastes any different because I've never tasted it. There's a worldwide boycott of all products of Coca-Cola company for murdering union organizers in Colombia and in Guatemala. For more information, see killercoke.org. So how can a program possibly be free? Only through an explicit declaration by the copyright holders giving the users the 4 freedoms. And this declaration is called a free software license. So any declaration that clearly and adequately gives users the 4 freedoms is a free software license. We have more specific criteria about what practices are acceptable in gnu.org/philosophy/free-sw.html if you're curious to know more. But there are many ways to write a free software license. So what's special about the GNU General Public License, the GNU GPL? It's a copyleft license, whereas most free software licenses are non-copyleft. You see, even in the early days, I saw how it could happen that someone would release a free program and someone else would make a modified version of it and distribute it as non-free software. This happened with the first versions of TeX that could run on Unix. TeX itself was free software, just barely, but its license was not copyleft, and that meant it permitted somebody else to make a modified version that would run on Unix, but his version was non-free, which meant it might as well not exist at all. Well, I realized that if middlemen could get copies of the components of GNU and then release their versions as non-free software, that would make GNU a failure. Our goal was to give the users freedom, give all users freedom, not just give freedom to a few people who would turn around and deny it to everybody else. That would be failure. So I looked for a way to stop it from happening. All I had to go on was copyright law. So I came up with a way of writing a license that would give everybody the 4 freedoms, but with a condition. And the condition says, when you distribute copies, either exact or modified, you must respect the freedom of the next person the same way we respected yours. Or, putting you in the role of the ultimate recipient, it means the middleman is not allowed to strip off the freedom from the code and pass on to you just the code without the freedom. Specifically, the way this works is with positive requirements saying when you distribute, there are certain things you have to do, and what they add up to is making sure the next person gets the 4 freedoms. For instance, you can't change the license. You have to pass it along on the same license under which you got it. And that includes whatever you add to the program, because otherwise anybody could make the program non-free just by adding something that would give him an excuse. And you must provide or make available the source code. You're not allowed to distribute binaries and say the source is secret, because that would make the program proprietary. And you have to give the users a copy of the license so that they know their rights. So we have copyleft free software licenses, primarily the GNU GPL, but there are some others. And then there are lots of non-copyleft free software licenses. They all respect your freedom. If you get a copy of a program under any of these licenses, you have the 4 freedoms. But the copyleft licenses go further, and they actively defend the freedom for all users. And this is surely why the GNU GPL is used for 2/3 of all the free software projects. So, Linux in 1991 was not free software. It was released under a license that didn't go quite far enough. It did not allow commercial distribution, and that meant that certain users, namely businesses, could not have freedom 2 or freedom 3, freedom to redistribute exact copies or the freedom to distribute modified versions. And if some users were denied the 4 freedoms, then it's not free software. However, in '92, Torvalds re-released Linux under the GNU GPL, and that made it free software. And thus, it was possible to combine Linux, the kernel, and the incomplete GNU system, making a complete free operating system, the first one that had existed since the 1970s. For the first time, it was possible to buy a PC and run it in freedom. So the liberation of Linux under the GPL was a major contribution to the free software community. However, the people who combined Linux with the various pieces of the GNU system were so focused on Linux that they thought of the rest of the system as a small add-on, and they started talking about the combination as the Linux system, in effect not giving us credit for our work. And the people who started using this combination imitated them, and that's how it is that millions of people use this variant of the GNU system, and they don't know that's what they're using. They think it's all Linux, that it was all started by Mr. Torvalds in 1991, and they think it all comes from his vision of life. And that's the really bad problem. You see, of course, if they call it Linux, that's not giving us credit and it's not fair. Please call it GNU/Linux or GNU+Linux and give us equal mention. That's, I'm sure, what you believe is the right thing to do. But if it were just an issue of credit, it would not be such an important thing. Wouldn't deserve this much attention. But there's something a lot more important at stake in your choice of name for the system. Your freedom is at stake. Indirectly, of course, because directly the choice of name doesn't change anything. If you call the rose an onion, it will smell just as sweet, but you'll confuse a lot of cooks. So the name you choose does make a difference. Since 26 years ago, well, you see, it makes a difference because the words you use determine what message you communicate to other people, and that's how you influence their thoughts, which later on guide their actions. So, since 26 years ago, the name GNU has been associated with our ideas of freedom. But the name Linux has not been. It's associated with the ideas of Mr. Torvalds. And what are those? Well, he doesn't agree with the idea that users like you deserve freedom. He doesn't care whether we have freedom or not. He doesn't care whether he has freedom or not. He doesn't value even his own freedom. He says he just wants convenient, powerful software. So he's only interested in superficial, practical values. And he has a right to state his opinions. But it's not fair for him to use and cite our tremendous work, which we did for the sake of freedom, as if it were his work, as a basis to oppose our campaign for freedom. But that's what happens when people think that the whole system is Linux. They assume that he started it and that it comes from his vision of life, so they tend to adopt his ideas, and he states publicly that he doesn't mind giving up his own freedom. So people who imitate him don't learn to value their own freedom, and the result is that it weakens us in defending our freedom. And that's something that is often difficult. Freedom is frequently threatened. And to keep it, you have to defend it. I mean, just look at how much damage Bush did to human rights all around the world, and in particular in the US. You can see that this is true, and Obama is doing very little to try to undo the damage. But in other areas of life, the debate about human rights has gone on for decades or centuries. A lot of time to reach conclusions about what human rights people deserve and spread these ideas around the world. But which doesn't always enable us to defend human rights, but it provides a base to try. But computing is a rather new area of life. Even in the US, it's less than 20 years that most people have used computers of any kind. And in other countries, it's much less. Now, this is not much time to have a debate about what human rights a user deserves in running a program, even if we had tried to have a debate. But for the most part, there has been no debate, because almost everyone started using computers with proprietary software, surrounded by other users of proprietary software, and they didn't know of any other possibility. So they took for granted that software could be proprietary. They assumed that that was legitimate, which means, in effect, that they let the proprietary software developers dictate to the answer, what human rights do you deserve in using a program? And they dictated essentially none at all. We can decide and impose whatever rules we wish. The answer that was most convenient for them. So the users accepted this, and they gave up their freedom without even knowing they were losing anything, because they've never thought that they were entitled to any. So who tries to start this debate? We in the free software movement believe we have identified 4 human rights that you deserve in using a program, namely the 4 freedoms that define free software. But when we try to bring these ideas to the attention of the public, even of the users of our own system, we have to overcome 2 big obstacles. One is the users don't know of the GNU system, don't know it's the GNU system. They think it's Linux. They think it was started by Mr. Torvalds, and so they mostly follow his idea of not valuing freedom at all. And when they see, for instance, articles in which we explain the philosophy of free software that's associated with GNU, they say, oh, why read that? That's just GNU, and I'm a Linux user. And of course, they're talking about the GNU system when they say that. How ironic. If they knew it was the GNU system, then they might see a reason to pay attention to why we developed it. And we might be able to convince them to value their own freedom, and then they might help us fight for it. But nowadays, there's another big obstacle. Most people who've heard of our software don't know the term free software, because the people who don't agree with us have a different term. They call the software, quote, open source, unquote, as a way of covering up the ethical level of the issue completely, of never even raising the question of whether proprietary software is an injustice. What happened was that during the 90s, as the gnu+linux system gained popularity among techies, some of them recommended it to others for purely practical reasons. It was powerful, flexible, reliable, efficient, and you didn't have to pay for a license. So more and more people started using it, and we then had to try to teach them that there was an issue of freedom in all this. But lots of them didn't listen. So there was a dispute within the community between 2 camps. There were those of us who valued freedom and social solidarity, and then there were those who only valued practical convenience. So we argued with each other. But in 1998, that second group chose a new term, open source, that had not been used before. And this was their opportunity to never even hint at the idea of an issue of freedom in all this. Since it was a new term, they got to decide what ideas to associate it with and which ideas to leave out. They left out the entire ethical level of the issue. They only mentioned practical advantages, thus implicitly saying practical values are the only ones there are. They don't always explicitly say that. Some open source supporters do explicitly say that. Sometimes they just don't talk about it. But since they only refer to practical values, implicitly they're saying that. And that's why I disagree with open source. I'm not a supporter of open source. But you've probably seen many articles that called me one. Well, they're all wrong, but why is this error repeated so much? What happened was, when a large part of our community started saying open source in 1998 and not raising any ethical issues, there were already many businesses in the free software community that developed or distributed free software. And most of them were also involved in proprietary software. They didn't want to teach people to value freedom, because then those people would not be potential future clients for proprietary products. So those businesses chose to say open source and avoid raising the issue. And of course, the journalists and politicians mostly followed the businesses. And ever since then, the free software movement is mostly by convention not mentioned in the mainstream media. When they mention our work, they call it open source, and they give the impression that we agree with those other people. Now, they've got a right to promote their views. It's not right for them to give the idea that we agree with their views. So over and over, I see articles talking about me and describing my work as open source, or describing me as an open source advocate, which I've never been. I disagree with it. You know, you might as well call me a conservative advocate. Some articles call me the father of open source. When that happens, I send a letter to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, then it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. And then I use this humorous beginning as the introduction to an explanation of the free software movement and how that's what I really stand for, and that it's different from open source. Because what I want to do is show people the ideas of the free software movement. That's why I'm speaking here today. That's why I give speeches, well, I haven't counted them, but I give a lot of speeches. Because the free software movement is not dead. The mainstream media don't mention it, but we're still here. I think we're still growing, and we're still teaching more people that they deserve freedom when they use software. But we need your help to do this. And the simplest, quickest ways you can help are by calling the system gnu+linux and by saying free software or free libre software. Use any word for free as in freedom in a convenient language. When you see other people having a discussion talking about open source or closed source and mentioning only practical convenience as a goal, you have the opportunity to say free software and mention the more important, deeper values that are at stake as well, so that important things don't get decided based, for the long term, don't get decided based on some short-term convenience, a practice which is often known as pragmatism. although strictly speaking, it's not more or less pragmatic to engage in such short-term thinking than to engage in long-term thinking. But the term is often misused by the people who practice short-term thinking in that way. So, of course, if you have more time to dedicate, you could do more. You can write articles about the issue of freedom. You can learn to give speeches, as I learned to give speeches. You can help as much as you have time that you're willing to give. But please help us at least a little bit. It's a big fight, and as you know, there are large proprietary software companies which the media usually don't even hint at any criticism of, and every year they're exploring new ways to attack and hurt the users. And all of us face this threat to our freedom in the future. Ultimately, our future depends on what we value. And so talking about our values is crucial. In 1984, the job to be done was mainly writing some free software and distributing it to people. We still need to do more of that, but it's not enough. Because if you have freedom and you don't value it, you are likely to lose it. The fool and his freedom are soon parted. And in our community, we've received and lost freedom several times because most of our community didn't appreciate the freedom it had. I'll give you a couple of examples. In 1992, Torvalds liberated Linux under the GNU General Public License, and thus the free gnu+linux system came into existence. It was possible to install it in a PC, but not easy. At that point, you had to be a real expert to be able to install gnu+linux. So people got to work on trying to make it easier. They developed distributions of gnu+linux. A few years later, there were several distros in competition. And the developers of one distro had the idea that they could gain more success by putting in proprietary programs and presenting them to the community as advantages. This worked because most of the community wasn't thinking about freedom and didn't value their own freedom. So they saw these convenient proprietary programs presented as a bonus, and they said, oh, that's great, let's use it. And then the developers of the other distros saw that and said to themselves, uh-oh, they've got an advantage. What are we going to do? We better put in proprietary programs in our distro too. And so over the next few years, they did. 10 years ago, when people asked me, hey, where can I get a copy of this system? I had to say, I'm sorry, I don't know any place I could recommend to you, because there are dozens of distros and all of them contain non-free software, so there is none that my conscience can let me recommend to you. So we had reached freedom and fallen back. We lost it for failure to value it. Well, I'm happy to say that today there are some completely free gnu/linux distros. For instance, there is Ututo, U-T-U-T-O. And there is BLAG, which stands for BLAG, Linux, and GNU. And there is gnusense, which is spelled G-Nu-sense. But the name is a joke because my job title as the head of the GNU project is the Chief Gnusense, spelled differently. And then there is Triskel, and there is Dragora, and there are a few others. The list of them is in gnu.org/distros, which also explains how various well-known distros fail to be entirely free. Of course, you'll have noticed that the distros I just mentioned don't include the ones that you usually hear of. the well-known popular distros continue to contain or recommend non-free software. They're developed by people who say they're supporters of open source, which means that they don't see any reason to reject these user-subjugating programs, and they don't. And the result is we have barely begun to recover the freedom that we lost in the 90s. It's a good beginning, but we have a long way to go before we reach the point where we could take for granted that if somebody is installing gnu+linux, that means she's installing only free software. And then we lost our freedom in another way. In 1992, Linux became free software, but today that's not true anymore. If you look at the source files of Linux, you will find in various files long lists of numbers. These are actually executable programs dressed up as source code. The real source code for those programs is not available. And that means they're not free software, and they're not source code either. Dressing up, taking an executable program and dressing it up as source code doesn't make source code. So, because of this, there are pieces of Linux which are not free software. Also, some of them carry explicit non-free licenses. These programs are known as blobs, and they are firmware. In other words, they don't run on the CPU. They run in various other processors. But if you have them installed in your system, you can't deny that you've got non-free software installed in your system. So what can we do about this? Nowadays, we maintain a version of Linux which is all free software. We call it Linux Libre, or free Linux in Spanish or French. And what we do is, every time Torvalds releases a new version, we just take it and we delete the non-free parts. So it's not a big job, but it has to be done. Because in order for a distro of gnu+linux to be entirely free, in particular, it can't have any non-free software inside its copy of Linux. And the symbol of Linux Libre is a penguin washing himself with a brush to get rid of the non-free software. And his name is Fredo. So it's easy to lose your freedom if you don't pay attention. So if we want to establish lasting freedom, it's not enough just to make free software and hand it out and give people freedom, because they'll drop it in the mud and it'll get all crushed if they don't care about it. So we have to teach them to care too. We have to teach them to think about freedom, to recognize freedom and recognize losing freedom, so that they will defend their freedom. And this is, therefore, what we free software activists focus on. After all, there are lots of people developing free software. Sure, we would like more, but the biggest shortage is in people to teach others about freedom, people to remind others when they're having a discussion of how to do a certain project. Let's not fail to think in terms of freedom for us and for our users, because it's so tempting to just ignore that and do whatever is expedient in a purely practical sense in the shortest possible term. And today there is a new way to lose control of your computing. It's called software as a service. And what does it mean? It means that instead of doing your computing in your own computer operating on the data you have, you send that data to somebody else's server where various programs run and you don't know what they are, and they operate on the data you sent, and they do your computing, and then they send the result back to you, or they take action directly on your behalf. And this way, you don't control your computing. You might as well be using a proprietary program for all the control you've got. Except actually, it's even worse. You see, with a proprietary program, you typically have an executable but no source code. Now, theoretically, it's possible to reverse engineer and understand the executable, but in practice, if it isn't small, that's not feasible. And then changing it is even harder. So practically speaking, you can't study or change that software. With software as a service, you don't get the source code and you don't get the executable, which means that it's absolutely impossible for you to study it and change it. You don't even have the option of trying to do, the possibility of trying to do reverse engineering, because the executable is running in the server where you can't even see it. But it's even worse than that. Some proprietary programs have malicious spyware features that send some of the data about what's going on in the machine to somebody's server. They send some data about you or from you. Well, with software as a service, you have to send the data to the server in order for it to be operated on. So they get the same result, but without having to put any special code into the program to achieve it. Spyware requires specific code to send messages, but software as a server just makes you do it. But either way, the server gets some of your data, and who knows what they're going to do with it after that. But it's even worse than that. Some proprietary programs have backdoors that allow the developer to forcibly install changes in the software. Specific code allowing them to do this. Well, with software as a service, the programs are running in his server, and of course he can install different programs anytime. He ought to be able to install different programs. It's his computer. But the result is that he can change the software that's doing your computing without asking you, just as with these back doors. So the result is software as a service is automatically equivalent to proprietary software with spyware and a backdoor. Don't use it. There's nothing that can make software as a service acceptable. Some people think that software as a service is acceptable as long as they're running free software on the server. Well, that's basically like saying that what's a good analogy? Basically, it's saying that if it's like advising you to protect yourself from the flu by drinking purified water. I mean, it's the solution for a different problem. It's not a solution for this problem. If you're running a program, then you need to make sure it's free, because otherwise it's proprietary and it takes away your freedom. But software as a service automatically takes away your freedom, regardless of what software is running in the machine. Now, for the server operator's sake, I hope it's free software, because if he's running non-free software, that means he has lost control of his own server to somebody else. And that doesn't help you, it just hurts him. It doesn't correct the injustice towards you, it just does a different injustice towards him. Well, so I hope he's wise enough to use free software, but that doesn't help you. There's nothing that can make software as a service acceptable. You just have to reject it. Now, that's not very hard in practice, because software as a service is pretty rare. The vast majority of websites do publication. Let's just forget them. There's obviously no problem there. Well, let's look at the fraction that do something else. Most of them are not software as a service because what they're doing is not your computing. For instance, they're doing communication, or they let you publish things. They do e-commerce, which is a kind of communication. There are collaborative projects. There are search engines, which basically are a kind of publication. What you send to the search engine is just a request for what information you want it to give you. So what you're doing is you're looking through somebody else's data. So all these things are not software as a service. But nonetheless, there is some software as a service. For instance, Google Docs is software as a service, because it invites you to do word processing in spreadsheet in somebody else's server instead of doing it on your own machine, as people have done for 30 years. So it's inviting you to give up control of computing, which in the past we free software users had control over. And then automatic translation, yeah, that's software as a service too. Oh, and if you use somebody else's search engine to provide a search feature on your own site, that's software as a service. The same search engine, if somebody just feels like searching, well, it's not software as a service because it's not doing his computing. But when you're using it to provide the search feature of your own website, that is your computing that it's doing. Now, this is not the only ethical issue raised by various web services. There are various others, but people already know about them. So I want you to know about this one too. So there are lots of ways we can lose our freedom, and we need to organize to defend it. And one thing we need to do to defend it effectively is occasionally we need to revise free software licenses. I developed the first copyleft license in 1985. It was called the gnu+linux General Public License. gnu+linux was the only piece of GNU software that was useful to release at the time. So I had to write a license for it, and I did. And then when I wrote GDB, I put on it a slightly modified GDB, General Public License. And then when I wrote GCC, I gave it the GCC General Public License. And I updated them from time to time, although each program had a release schedule that was different because I couldn't work on them all at the same time. So they had different licenses. If nothing else, they were different because the gnu+linux General Public License mentioned gnu+linux and the GCC General Public License mentioned GCC. And since they were different, that meant you couldn't even, in principle, copy some code out of GCC and put it into Emacs because they were different licenses and incompatible with each other in this trivial way. I don't know if it would ever have been useful to copy code from GCC into Emacs, but the point is it was not a good thing that this was illegal. So to make it legal, I worked out a way to eliminate from the license the name of the program it applied to make just one license that I could use verbatim in all the programs that we were developing. And I released that in 1989 as the GNU General Public License, and then began switching over various GNU packages to use that. But because it was written so as to be so easy for other people to use on their own programs, people began doing that. I also put in a versioning mechanism. Now, I thought it would be wrong to say that when I release in the FSF, a future version, everybody's programs under the GPL will automatically be usable under that future version. I thought that it was my obligation to give the developers the choice. On the other hand, I also saw that if they didn't anticipate things, then we would have a problem, because suppose people release something under GPL version 1 and later on GPL version 2 came out, and the developers of a program might want to upgrade it to GPL version 2, but what if some of them couldn't be found anymore? It would be a problem. So I designed a mechanism where you could say GPL version N or any subsequent version, any later version is what it says. And so that way, whenever GPL version 2 comes out, this code will automatically allow GPL version 2 optionally. It'll still be usable under GPL version 1, but also people could use it under GPL version 2. Every user will have the choice. And this way, you can allow a program to upgrade smoothly to future GPL versions and avoid getting stuck. So it was in 1989-90, after GPL version 1, that I found out how dangerous software patents were. And I saw that there was a danger that patent holders would go to various distributors saying, threatening them to sue them for patent infringement and saying, well, we'll give you a patent license, but it won't allow your users to redistribute the way the GPL says they should be able to. So in GPL version 2, I put in a change that said that if anything legally stops you from distributing and giving the users the full freedom specified by the GPL, then you can't distribute at all. And I thought of this as the liberty or death clause. In other words, there was nothing I could do in a software license to protect my code from being destroyed or harmed by software patents. But I could say, rather than letting them make it proprietary, it'll just die instead. Because the worst thing that could possibly happen would be to let the code become an instrument of subjugating others. Better for it to die than that. So I put that in together with another change that accommodated the practice that had started of distributing operating systems without compilers. And sometimes the C library you could link with would come with a compiler instead of with the main part of the system. And the result of this was with GPL version 1, you weren't actually allowed to distribute an executable linked with that C library. This was not an intended result. We wanted people to be able to distribute the linked executables of our programs for those proprietary systems. So that was another change needed in GPL version 2, which came out in 1991. And then for a long time, there was no other version. Around 2000, 2001, I started writing a new version of the GPL, modified from GPL 2, but eventually I let it drop and that just went nowhere. But then in around 2004, I decided it was time to get seriously working on GPL version 3. We published a draft at the beginning of 2006 and went through a public review in which a large mechanism of people was set up to study comments, think about them, report issues to me and the lawyers would study things, and eventually I would decide what to do. So GPL version 3 came out in 2007, The basic idea, of course, is unchanged. It's establish and defend freedom for all users. But there are many improvements in it because the world doesn't stand still. For instance, we found out that many countries have in their copyright law divergent definitions of distribution. So when GPL version 2 used the term distribution, in effect, it caused results that varied unnecessarily from country to country. So in GPL version 3, we just don't use that term. We use other terms which we define in a rather indirect way, which is designed to, in a way that I'm sure some people in NIST will appreciate, just so as to insulate the legal results from that particular kind of variation between different countries' copyright law. Now, since copyleft is always implemented using copyright, there are some kinds of variations in copyright law between countries which will inevitably have an effect, and there's no way we can prevent that. But at least we got rid of some of this noise that we could get rid of. I don't know why I am so thirsty. It's bizarre. Anyway, so we define terms to propagate the program and to convey it, and gave these. So convey turns out to be our substitution for distribution, but it's defined in terms of other things, so that it comes out meaning more or less the same thing instead of varying. Now, another problem we had begun to see was digital handcuffs. Digital handcuffs were extremely rare in 1991, but by the 2000s, many countries already had laws which prohibit the distribution of free software that can be used to break digital handcuffs. And we had even seen discussion of using free software to implement digital handcuffs. And the idea is absurd. Of course, those people don't talk about free software, they talk about open source. So there are projects for open source DRM. Now, that way they avoid hypocrisy, because if you never endorse any principles of supporting people's freedom, you can't be hypocritical when you try to take it away. So, after all open source says is that they want to make powerful, reliable software by letting the users study and change and redistribute the code. So their idea is to make powerful, unbreakable digital handcuffs by letting people study and change the code, and then ultimately they'll give you something you can't really change. So they don't want to give freedom to the users, and what they have in mind is not to give freedom to the users. They're not going to give you free software, but they can develop it as open source in order to shaft you more thoroughly and inescapably. And therefore, we put in an article basically to defeat those laws, to saying if somebody uses free software to create digital handcuffs, then it's okay for the users to break those handcuffs. By using software under GPL version 3 to make the handcuffs, they give up their legal option of attacking the users for breaking them. So at least this way we can be sure they won't use our software to chain you. But there are further problems in this. You see, since 1991, new methods of attacking the freedom of users and turning free software effectively proprietary have been developed. One of them we call TiVoization, after the malicious product that first did it. And what it consists of is building a product and distributing free software under GPL version 2 in it, but designing the product so that if you install a modified version of that software, the product refuses to run at all and it shuts down. TiVo started out using some software under GPL version 2 and violating the license. So the FSF complained to them and said, you're infringing copyright by violating the license, you have to stop. So they began shipping the source code to users, and they invited users to improve the software. And then they made a new model where the users were unable to install modified software. So they still complied with GPL version 2. They would ship you the source code, which you could modify and compile, and you could even install it in the TiVo if you wanted it not to run anymore. Well, this turns freedom 1, the freedom to study and change the source code so that the program does what you wish, into a theoretical fiction, which has no real existence. So in GPL version 3, we say that when they distribute executables with a product, they must tell you the information you need so that you can install your modified version and have it actually run and actually not be blocked from functioning because of the mere fact it's modified. Now, of course, your modifications could break it, of course. That's your problem. But they're not allowed to just stop you from modifying it or do something so that any modified version automatically can't possibly work. Now, this is only if there is a way to install modified versions. If they distribute the software in a ROM, that's still allowed. But if they have a way to make a modified version that will get installed and run, they've got to tell you how to do it to the machine you have bought. Now, they don't have to tell you how to install in anybody else's machine. If each machine has its own key, they have to tell you the key for your machine. So, that's one new way of attacking freedom. The other was exemplified in the Novell-Microsoft Pact, where Microsoft came up with a clever way to try to use its patents to turn Novell's gnu+linux distribution into effectively proprietary software. And here's the way they do it. Since GPL version 2 would not let them give users patent licenses, they would not let them give Novell a patent license that would restrict what Novell's users could do with the software. So instead, they made an agreement with Novell to give Novell's customers patent licenses, not Novell, because then they would have conflicted with the liberty or death clause in GPL 2. Instead, they give the licenses to Novell's customers, but only to them, not to those they redistribute to. So this was a new attack on the GPL. And fortunately, Microsoft did it before we had finished GPL version 3. So we put in things, basically explicit patent licenses. And this was necessary anyway, though, really, because it turns out that in other countries, there is no implicit patent license. If you give somebody a program and say, you can use this, you could turn around later and sue him for using it using a patent. If you have a patent, you could sue him for patent infringement because he used the program you gave him and told him he could use. In the US, you can't do that. If you gave him the program and told him he can use it, and he can use it, and any claims you might come up with later are estoppel. But Other countries don't do it that way. So in order to stop perverted and malicious distributors from offering people free software and later suing them for running it, or for redistributing it, or for using patents, we had to make the license have an explicit patent license in it. Now, this was something we had seen in other 1990s free software licenses, such as the MPL. So those are a couple of things that responded to new threats. But there were other kinds of problems in the community that weren't threats. They were just problems. For instance, there was a lot of software under the Apache license, and that was incompatible with the GNU GPL. So there were these two bodies of software that couldn't be linked together or merged. So we managed to make GPL version 3 compatible with the Apache license version 2, the current version. And so you can now take any Apache license code and combine it with GPL 3 covered code in the same program. We were initially thinking we'd be able to get compatibility also with the Eclipse license, but turned out it was just too far. We couldn't get there. Now, another new issue that had arisen was BitTorrent. BitTorrent didn't exist in 1991. It hadn't been invented. But in the 2000s, people were finding BitTorrent useful as a way of distributing binaries of gnu+linux distributions. Now, those distros would have hundreds or thousands of programs in them. If you were distributing the binary of one program, you wouldn't bother to use BitTorrent. That's just not big enough. But when you put thousands together and you get a binary distro, it's quite useful to speed things up with BitTorrent. But there's a problem with it. You see, if you were downloading something with BitTorrent, then you're also uploading. And if you're downloading the binary of a GPL2 covered program with BitTorrent, then you're also distributing it. And GPL2 says you're only allowed to distribute binaries if you also make available the corresponding source code. But these users were not doing that because they weren't thinking of themselves as distributing the binaries. They thought of themselves as just getting a copy. So they were violating the GPL. Well, obviously that's not desirable. BitTorrent is a nice thing, and there's nothing wrong with what they were doing. So in GPL version 3, there's a clause that says that if you're redistributing a binary as automatic part of getting your own copy of that same binary, that's okay. So those who launch the torrent have to distribute the source as well. But all the people who are participating in the torrent to get their copies, they just don't have a requirement. Another problem, which was only half new, had to do with how the license terminates. Under GPL2 as GPL1, if you violate the license, you lose your license. Poof. And, you know, in the 1980s, that was okay because people were distributing individual programs. And if they did it wrong, well, then they lost their license. But we would talk to them, and if they were in good faith and willing to comply, then we would give them back their license. Because what we wanted was just to have them respect other people's freedom. But when you're distributing an entire GNU/Linux distro, which was the practice that developed in the 90s, well, if you do that wrong, if you fail to provide the source code of that, you could lose your license to thousands of different programs all at once. And the only way to get the license back would be to ask for forgiveness from all the copyright holders. And that might be tens of thousands, if not more. So You couldn't possibly do it. And this was not good. We want to be able to enforce the GPL to make people stop violating it. But when people make a mistake, we don't want them to have a big problem. So GPL version 3 has a more gentle kind of termination. What it says is, if you're violating the GPL, any copyright holder of the code who notices can send you a complaint. And that gives him the opportunity to terminate your license later. It doesn't terminate automatically, but he can decide to terminate it later. However, if you correct your practice, if you cease to violate the GPL and then 60 more days go by, then complaints cease to be valid. So that means if you make a mistake and you are told about it and you correct it and then 60 days go by, anyone who has not complained to you yet no longer can. So that means you get a list of complaints from specific copyright holders, and you then have to talk with them and assure them, you see, I've corrected it, I know what to do, I'm not going to do this wrong again, and ask them not to terminate your license. But this is at least doable, because these are people who have just complained to you, and they presumably told you how to reach them, and they're not tens of thousands. They might at worst be a few dozen. So it's feasible to talk with them all. And to make it even a little bit easier, somebody's first violation with any given program gets forgotten automatically if he corrects his practices within a certain period of time after he's told about it. So this is an important thing to do with these large distros. Now, actually, I think I should visit the toilet before I continue. When I come back, I'll tell you about the Affero GPL. So I'm back. So the Affero GPL. In the early 2000s, somebody started a company called Affero, which was going to make some free software for use in network servers. And he was concerned that since the program was mainly for use in network servers, somebody else might make an improved version of it and never release it, just run it on his own servers. And the result is that the improvements wouldn't get out to the community. And he wanted to avoid that. So I thought about precisely what the borderline of free software was, and I concluded that it was okay, it was legitimate to require that if somebody publicly uses the program, such as by using it on a server that the public's invited to access, that he make the source code of his version available to that public. And so that's what the original Affero GPL was. It was GPL version 2 modified with a paragraph about that. So along with GPL version 3, we also published the GNU Affero GPL. Version 3 was the first version, but it's version 3. And what it says, it's GPL version 3, but with a somewhat cleaner requirement, saying if you make a server and you let some people connect to it, you've got to let them access the source code of whatever version of this program is running on that server. So the problem that the Affero GPL addresses is a problem that affects the community of developers. For programs that are meant to be installed by people on their own machines, well, anybody who makes a modified version is going to distribute them, and then whatever version of the GPL is going to say, he's got to provide the source code, meaning that if it's widely available, you, the original developer, will be able to get his source code, and you'll get it under the GPL. But that doesn't work if the people who make the improvements just run their modified versions on their own servers. Well, I don't think I'm going to need that many. Unless I want to take a bath. But thank you.
You're welcome.
So, this is not a solution to the problem of SAS. There's no way a software license can help you with SAS, because the problem with SAS, software as a service, is that you don't have control over your own computing because it's being done under the control of someone else. It doesn't help if the software in the server is under the Affero GPL. That just means you can get a copy of that software. Well, if you get a copy of that software and then you run it on your own machine, yes, then that helps. But as long as you keep doing your computing in his server, it doesn't help. You still have no control. On the other hand, most servers are not SAS. So there are lots of perfectly legitimate things for servers to do and lots of jobs that are useful in these servers for free software, but they do run into the problem that the Affero GPL can solve. And someone mentioned to me here that he was concerned that some large companies are preparing to start providing remote access to use R, and that they might improve R in ways that they would never release because they would never distribute the binaries of their improved versions to anybody either. So maybe that means R ought to be under the Affero GPL. Although the GNU Affero GPL is not a solution for the SAS issue, and although it was originally intended for programs that might be used in other kinds of servers, in fact, if SAS becomes a frequent threat, a more frequent practice than it is now, then we might find programs needing the Affero GPL just to cause their improvements to get published, which 4 years ago we would never have thought might need it. The reason why I didn't put the Affero requirement into GPL version 3, pure and simple, is that I saw that a lot of developers wouldn't be happy with that. It may be that we need to see how big the problem gets to be before our community understands the need to solve it. And unlike global warming, there's no way to model what's going to happen. It's not physics, it's just sociology. So we'll have to see. So, if you want more information about the GNU system and the free software movement, look at gnu.org. If you want various resources to help with the use of free software, or if you want to join the Free Software Foundation, go to fsf.org. Please join, we need your support. And now I will present my other identity. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor which I wrote, which then an extensible text editor, which became a way of life for many users, as it was extended so much they could do all their computing inside Emacs. And then it became a religion with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs, which you might enjoy visiting. Today, in the Church of Emacs, we have a great schism between various rival versions of Emacs. And we also have saints, but no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. And then, if you become truly expert, you can celebrate that by having a FUBAR mitzvah, a ceremony in which you recite lines from the system's source code. We reject the priesthood of technology by allowing everyone to read our sacred scriptures. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs. The Virgin of Emacs is anyone who has not used Emacs. And according to the Church of Emacs, offering the Virgin the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is considered a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages over other churches I won't mention. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy, but it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever evil proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control or are set up for your regular use, and then install a wholly free operating system, and then only use and install free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint, and you too will have the right to wear a halo, if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people have asked me whether it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the other editor, VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. Sometimes people have asked me whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So, thank you very much.
Richard, can you take some questions?
Yes.
Okay, you want to have any questions?
Please note that I am almost deaf, so if you want me to hear you, you need to speak loud and slowly and clearly like this.
If everyone that has a question could proceed to one of the microphones, that would be great.
Thank you. First, thank you for a fascinating talk. I'm curious about your idea about data portability, Facebook, and privacy.
One question at a time, please. Sorry, I can't remember multiple questions to answer them. I'll talk about data portability. Well, basically that means using defined formats. And of course we want to do that. But do note that if the format is supported by free software, then at least it's specified by the code. Now that may not be ideal, but it's better than nothing. Whereas if you use a format that's only specified by the proprietary program that implements it, then you're screwed. Now, as far as Facebook is concerned, The business model of Facebook is collecting people's personal information and abusing it. You shouldn't use Facebook. Now, Facebook, by the way, is not software as a service. It's basic services of kind of communication and publication. So, there are various, as I said, there are other ethical issues raised by network servers, and Facebook is a good example of how bad a service can be for other reasons. There are other problems with Facebook. It does or did try to appropriate people's works that they post there, giving Facebook the right to use them for commercial purposes in an unlimited way. So absolutely you shouldn't post anything there. Of course, you shouldn't use it at all. It uses Flash for distributing video, and that's bad. Now, it's conceivable that Ganesh, the GNU free Flash player, will work with those Flash videos. I don't know. It's still a bad thing to use Flash to distribute anything, to use Flash in any website. And also there are various secondary services supported by Facebook, and some of them are SaaS. So plenty of reasons, but some of them they could correct. But the fundamental one, that the business model is based on mistreating people, they'll never correct that. You have to correct it. Facebook is not your friend.
So, the question, if I may?
Can I go next?
No.
Okay, the question I have is from the point of view of the society, that you seem to have this long-term viewpoint, society's viewpoint, freedom viewpoint, so on. But what bothers me is that the free software foundation, it is not going to create any wealth.
I think you're mistaken. In any case, our society makes too much emphasis on wealth and creating wealth. And yet, since we don't have democracy and freedom sufficiently, whatever wealth gets created goes to the rich. In the U.S., until the financial crisis, there was tremendous gain in production and income, national total income, and all the benefit went to a tiny fraction of the wealthy. The poorest people were worse off 3 years ago than they were in 1980 because of course, of right-wing policies designed to fight a class war against the poor. So I'm not really so interested in talking about how to create any wealth. In any case, I'm more concerned with my freedom than with my wealth. And I don't want to have any wealth at the expense of my freedom. I'm not so concerned about innovation. And the reason is innovation can be good or bad. At one point, democracy was an innovation. At one point, dictatorship was an innovation. Innovations can be good or bad, and if we don't judge them based on more important criteria, we'll get a lot of bad ones. Especially in corporatocracy, what can we expect? And I've learned to expect since around 10 years ago that innovations in digital technology are usually malicious. And I've tried to formulate a law that basically says, to the extent that technological advances give us the ability to do something more, new forms of restriction will take away our ability to do what we did before, and thus it's no gain. So
wealth is not important, but it's the wealth that allows us to have a hall like this.
Fine. What good is it to have a hall like this if we don't have it in freedom? By the way, you're mistaken. It's clear that free software is extremely useful. An official of MITI, the Japanese agency that made Japan's success, told me in the 1990s that GCC had contributed $1 billion to the world. So I think that's ridiculous. I have no way of telling whether he was flattering me or whether any of that's true. I don't know how to measure what GCC has contributed in economic terms. I don't know how to measure what R has contributed in economic terms. I'm sure they're both substantial. But there are things we need besides just wealth. After all, the world has lots of wealth and makes too many things. In America, it certainly makes too many things. We have too many things. We're destroying the world with all the things we make. There are gigantic areas of the ocean where plastic debris is floating and killing birds and fish. So we need to make somewhat less things if we want to keep our planet going. Parts of Washington, D.C. are not very far above sea level, and if we don't want them to be submerged in a century or so, or maybe less, we'd better start making less things. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't like to be broke. I wouldn't like to be starving, but starvation because of too little things being made or too little total wealth, that's not the danger we really face. The danger we face in the U.S. is giving it all away to the banks or giving it all away to mercenary military contractors like Blackwater and the rest of the military-industrial complex.
So I have a question related to software as service, or SaaS. So as data sets are growing ever larger, and some of the computational power necessary to deal with them in a timely fashion becomes greater as well, it becomes less likely that individual researchers will have access to such computing power on their individual machines. So if we want to provide this service to users on our machines, how else can we do it besides putting it out there, providing the source code for anyone who wants to look at it, but having it run on our servers?
Well, if they, when running their work, can install their software, which say in a sandbox so that they can't hurt anything else, then that's not SaaS. That's providing computing facilities.
But if you say, okay, I have a program that runs on the given server in which they can give their data, and then out pops an answer, they can look at it.
That's SaaS, so you shouldn't do it that way. That's not the only way you can do it, and that's the bad way to do it. It's not enough just to show them the source code if they can't decide what source code they're going to run.
I think that this would be rather difficult, though, to deal with the sandboxing question.
I think it can be done.
Government machines.
I think it can be done.
Do you know any projects that are working on it?
I wouldn't have the faintest idea.
Okay.
It's not my field. I don't know about, I'm the last to know about such projects. You could start one.
If you use free software, how are you supposed to defend yourself from hackers? Because they can see the code.
Hackers? You mean people who enjoy playful cleverness like me?
Okay.
That's what a hacker is.
The correct term then.
You mean crackers?
Yes, that. How are you supposed to defend yourself from people?
Well, it's a strange question. It's like saying if an airplane is heavier than air, how is it supposed to fly? Well, the fact is they do, and the fact is free software has better security than a lot of proprietary software such as Windows. So you might want to ask, instead of saying, how could we implement security, you might want to ask how we do and why it is pretty good. Basically, it turns out that crackers can find vulnerabilities anyway. They don't need to fully understand the software. They just need to figure out where there might be cracks that they can get through. And free software generally does a pretty good job of providing security. But remember, who do you have to fear when you're using a computer? Who is likely to put malware into the software you're running? If you're running proprietary software, malware is likely to be put in by the developer. However, discussions of security often customarily define that as not part of the problem. They focus artificially on malware installed by somebody other than the developer of the software, who wasn't authorized to put in the malware. But that's artificial. I don't see any reason why I should prefer to suffer from the digital handcuffs explicitly written by the developer than suffer from from a virus. You know, some viruses will delete your files. Some systems with their back doors will delete your files. Is one better than the other? I think they're both unacceptable. Now, free software is not a guaranteed protection against either one, but it's pretty good.
I'm curious on your...
Yeah.
Yes, I wonder, you commented about products and activity, a number of large companies, and I wonder, could you comment please about Google product and activity?
Products of Google. Well, the main product of Google I know about is Android. Android has a lot of free software in it, but what you get on a Google phone includes proprietary applications as well, and some proprietary drivers or firmware. And that means there's no way to use those phones without proprietary software. The applications you can delete. It's bad of Google to release non-free applications, but the phone will still do the basic things if you delete them. However, no one has as of yet done the reverse engineering necessary to make the free replacements for these drivers. And that's a job that needs to be done. Now, Google is much better known for its services. And they are varied, you know. A couple of them are software as a service, but lots of them are not. Many of them attempt to install non-free JavaScript programs into the user's browser. And to protect from that, you've got to turn off JavaScript. We're looking for someone to develop a change in NoScript that will make it automatically reject any JavaScript which is both non-trivial and non-free. So if it's trivial, it'll accept it, and if it carries a free license, it'll accept it, but if it fails to meet either one of those, then it won't run. On the other hand, some of those services will work if you have JavaScript turned off. Google at least tries, when there's no great difficulty, it makes the services run without JavaScript. And there are other sites I encounter that don't work at all without JavaScript, and I can't use them.
So, thank you for your talk. It was very good. I enjoyed it a lot. I was using a software project that was released under the GPL. They didn't specify a version.
They didn't specify a version. Yeah. I think that means you can use any GPL version you like.
Okay. The next release of that software, they went to a commercial license.
Well, there's no such thing as a commercial. I don't know what it means, a commercial license. Do you mean proprietary?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Proprietary, which they had a file that outlined it. No longer after that would distribute the source code. You get the source code for the previous version.
That's what you should use.
Well, yes, but I didn't know that that was even possible.
Oh, the copyright holders can legally do it. Now, one question is it legal, is it lawful, and the other is it ethical? It's always wrong to release non-free software, and therefore it was wrong. It would have been wrong even if they had not previously released a free version. But a separate question is the legality. The copyright holders of a work can release it in any number of different ways whenever they feel like it, legally.
I was just wondering, as someone who enjoys programming but also wants to make some money doing it, what are some models for distribution that allow people to release free software but also be compensated for the software?
Well, I don't want to use the term compensated for, because that implies that somehow you're being paid for work that you did, and I don't believe. And if you say, I want to hire you to do some work, and a person does the work, then you should pay him, right? You agreed to pay him. That's compensation. But that word misrepresents this situation, unless, if someone, there are situations where someone will pay you to write a particular free software program because he would like it to get written and no volunteers want to do it. And in that case, you're working on a job for him and he ought to pay you, so it's compensation. And in fact, that's probably the usual way people get paid for developing free software, because they're developing custom software and they're doing it for a certain client and the client's going to pay them. But if you talk about writing a program and releasing it, then the term compensation is inappropriate, because no user specifically owes you money. Now, it might be good and it might be the right thing to do for some users to support you, but that's supporting you is one thing and paying a debt to you is another. Now, there are people who develop free software and they just keep releasing this free software, but it's useful for a certain kind of business, and those businesses want some kind of support. So the businesses will buy support from them. If you're the author of the program, that's a pretty good selling point in order to sell support. There are also large companies that pay some people to write some free software just to be released.
More specifically, I'm just thinking the computer gaming industry, I think, is one of the largest hindrances to free software taking hold, because it'd be very difficult, I think, economically to release a free game, sort of.
Well, I don't think that a non-free game is legitimate, and I wouldn't have one.
Well, yeah, but I'm just wondering how one would go about developing a free game, but also.
Well, there are free games. In fact, it's getting easier, because a lot of games involve, at least as a very popular option, talking to a server where the people interact with each other. Now, if this gets really sophisticated, it becomes software as a service. But if it's not so sophisticated and they're just having a game, well, okay, and yet people can pay for having an account on the server.
I'm just thinking, yeah. I think there are a lot of games, like first-person shooters or, things that are really graphics intensive that no one's going to have sort of the resources to be able to develop free graphics engines or things like that can handle.
Well, I don't know if that's actually true, but I also don't care very much. When you, as an argument for giving up our freedom, it doesn't rest on, it rests on such a weak foundation that it can't support such a conclusion.
Thank you very much for the.
I think the person in the back has been waiting for a while.
Yeah, thanks for your talk. Very insightful. I was trying to understand some of the concepts you mentioned, and the thought that came to me was regarding search. For instance, when we all use web-based search, engines, things like that, where we go in and type, etc. The results that are displayed, right? I'm trying to understand whether is that an example of something that is considered free or not free software.
I'm sorry, the results of a search are not software at all. So there must be some misunderstanding, at least not from what I've seen. Of course, I don't use the web very much, but I've used some search engines, and I would type in some words, and I'd get a list of, hits that with links. Well, that's not software at all, so it can't be software of any kind. I don't understand what you mean by is it free or is it not free?
So let me understand. I think you mentioned that really you need to understand how your computing is done. So
Well, no, I didn't say you need to. I say you've got to be free to. Remember, freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it. It's not the obligation. I'm not saying that everybody has a duty to study every program that she uses. I don't study every program I use. I'm not saying that that's a requirement. I'm just saying you should be free to do so.
So, I don't think we are free to understand how Google actually presents the search results.
Right, but since that's not your computing, that's just asking Google to give you some of its data. So I don't think that it falls into the area where we have a right to demand anything.
So the GPL has been defended, in my understanding, a number of times against wholesale copying of source code from one program to a proprietary program. But I have a very hard time disentangling the legal intricacies of derivative works. And to my knowledge, there's been no defense or no legal testing in a court of law of the derivative.
Probably not. That's but also derivative work is the wrong concept. The question is, does another work have substantial similarity due to copying? Right. Derivative work is one special case of that.
Okay, so my understanding from the GPL frequently asked question, that interpretation of, say, a function call to a GPL program, linking to a library that's GPL.
Well, that's a combined program which contains the GPL covered piece. And the GPL says you're only permitted to use that piece in the combination if the combination is entirely under the GPL.
So do you anticipate that particular interpretation being tested anytime in the near future?
No.
Okay, thanks.
You mean tested by an actual court case? No. Tested by our telling people you can't do that, and that they then change what they're doing, it's already been. But that's not an official legal precedent.
So in talking about rights, there's also the question of responsibilities that come up, especially in terms of government. So as citizens, we have this responsibility to pay taxes, some of which go to procurement of non-free software at, say, government institutions, for example. Do you view taxes as a necessary evil, and the use of taxes for things like...
I am in favor of taxes. I'm a liberal.
And do you have any problem with your taxes being used to buy non-free software?
Well, actually, I have much more of a problem with the use of non-free software by public agencies, because they have a responsibility to maintain control of their computing. But also the government, as part of its overall responsibility to set up society in a way that is good that serves the well-being and freedom of everyone, that they're helping to do something that's bad. They're helping to prop up something that's bad. It looks like there are no more questions.
The audience is exhausted, and so we have, I think, some refreshments.
Ah.